Good morning. Today we continue our Lenten series called Common Ground. It's about loving each other despite and because of our differences and looking at it through the lens of sibling interactions. Today we're going to look at three siblings who knew Jesus really well. They are Martha, Mary, and Lazarus. And we're going to look at each of the passages where we have stories about them. What's clear, and you'll see there are several stories, is that Jesus visited these siblings often. They lived in Bethany, which was near Jerusalem, and we just get this sense that anytime he was in the area, he stayed with them, and this is where he had friendship and fellowship and good food and a place to stay where people loved him and cared about him. In the first scripture that Morgan read for us, we find Jesus at their house. And Mary, the youngest sister, is sitting down at his feet. And Martha, who must be the oldest because it's mentioned that it's her house and she's hosting, she's preoccupied with preparations. And she really wants Jesus to tell Mary to get up and help her. Quick sidebar here. When I saw I was preaching on this, two sisters, a brother, I knew I was going to have some projections here. So I called my sister, I texted her, could I interview you about being the youngest? Long pause. Sure. And we really had a lovely visit, and it was really helpful. I realized as I read this story, I am so over-identified with Martha, it's not even funny. So, true confession, and I'm going to try to include other perspectives. So Martha's preoccupied. She'd like Jesus to get Mary to help her. And by the way, this does not go as Martha had planned. He doesn't tell Mary to help Martha. Jesus is always encouraging us to talk to people directly if we have a problem. You might remember a passage that we looked at recently in the Sermon on the Mount. It says if you have your gift and you're taking it to the altar and you realize that a brother or sister has a problem with you, to go and make peace with them and then come and bring your gift back to the altar. It doesn't say go tell the priest and get the priest to intervene on your behalf. It encourages you to go deal with the person directly. There's also another time in Luke where Jesus was preaching and somebody just called out in the crowd to him, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." I guess the person thought, I have a moment, I'm going to see if he'll do it. But Jesus doesn't do it. He doesn't go there. What he says is, "Friend, who sent me to be judge or arbiter over you?" So it's no surprise that when Martha approaches him, he doesn't tell that to Mary. Mary's sitting right there at his feet, I was a babysitter to my younger siblings. And at 12, 13, 14, I was the opposite of a skilled manager of young people. So while we're having true confessions, with my limited skill set, I often resorted to nefarious means and blackmail to get them to do what I wanted them to do when I was left in charge. It would sometimes go like this, Jessica, I won't tell that you left your dirty clothes under my bed during our room inspection if you don't tell that Joe threw red Jell-O on the popcorn ceiling. So things were not always easily controlled. And then would come the immediate pushback from either or both of them. "You're not the boss of me." So, when I heard this passage with Mary and Martha, it has very much the "you're not the boss of me" feeling to it. Obviously, Martha feels like she's justified in wanting Mary to help her, and even more so if she's asking Jesus to intervene. And I imagine that it would have been really hard for Mary to follow Martha. She's referred to in multiple passages as this excellent host. And I understand that if you're the youngest, it's hard to always feel like you're learning things after everybody else, that you're always a little behind the curve, that because you're younger and still practicing things that the older siblings have mastered, you just feel like you have trouble catching up. And then here is Jesus. Jesus takes Mary right where she is He doesn't care where she falls in the family. He sees her gifts right here, right now. He recognizes her disciples' heart. To sit at Jesus' feet is where the disciples sit to learn. You might remember that in the synagogues, the teachers sit in the chairs to teach, and so also in the homes. So when Martha says, "Tell Mary to help me," Jesus replies, "Martha, Martha, you are worried and distracted by many things, and there is need of only one thing. Mary has chosen the better part, which will not be taken from her." Jesus says something here that alerts us to the fact that this interaction isn't about what we think it's about. He uses the phrase, "one thing." We'll unpack it in a minute. But it reminded me of a clip that made the rounds a few years ago. Let's take a look at this short video.
It's just, there's all this pressure, you know? And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me, and I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's gonna stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever gonna stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
See, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See,
out.
you're not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just, sometimes it's like there's this achy, I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you.
So in this video, it might not be about the nail, but I think all of us can see that it's nail adjacent. Okay. So also in this passage with Martha and Mary, it might not actually be about who's serving, but we see that it's service adjacent. From Martha's perspective, she's probably feeling forgotten. Some theologians have lifted up that she maybe just wants Jesus' attention too and acknowledgement for what she's doing. From Jesus' perspective, maybe it's about keeping our eyes on ourselves and what we're doing, and not just what we're doing, but how we're doing it. To ask, is the way we're doing what we do, does it serve the development of our souls and our relationships with each other and with God? So it's service adjacent. Jesus is actually pretty gentle with Martha here, and it seems as if this one thing he's referring to is probably something they've discussed before, because he doesn't explain it. We're left trying to figure out, what is this one thing that is most important? And what he does is he reminds Martha not of what she needs to do, but what's important to her own growth and joy. And we can see how it might be about how she's doing things. Jesus has a similar interaction with Peter. Jesus told Peter that he was going to die in a way that he didn't choose, and then said to Peter, "Follow me." At which point Peter turned and saw another disciple approaching them and said to Jesus, "Well, Lord, what about him?" And Jesus' reply was, "If it's my will that he remain until I come again, what is that to you? You follow me." So again, he's shifting this emphasis on worrying about what everybody else is doing and telling Peter, we just had a really direct interaction. You worry about what I'm asking you to do. It seems that in this passage, Jesus is lifting up the need to attend to ourselves, to pay attention to the log in our own eyes, so to speak. And the one thing may be about, as Paul puts it, working out our own salvation with fear and trembling, and doing it in such a way that relationships in community and with God are respected. From Martha's perspective, it occurred to me that probably one of the real issues here is that I imagine on a daily basis, Martha and Mary have a routine. They prepare the meals together, they clean up together, and they just have this rhythm of the way things are done. Martha probably assumes that when Jesus is there, they'll have the same routine and she'll have the same amount of help. So Mary, by sitting at Jesus' feet, is operating outside the box of Martha's assumptions, and they may not have had a conversation about those assumptions. Something to notice here is that neither sister is seeing the other with grace or clarity. Mary doesn't see Martha's stress and get up and help her. Martha doesn't realize how absolutely important and pivotal real time with Jesus is to Mary. Martha probably just feels forgotten. There are so many ways this could go instead. The one that just pops up to me is Martha could ask Mary to help and ask Jesus to hold the end of that story until they could rejoin the group. So I've never been convinced when I've read this passage, even though I do identify with Martha, that it was about the service or the preparation of a meal. We know how important feeding people was to Jesus. Those are pivotal stories in all the Gospels. What's also really clear here, though, is that Jesus knows and values each of these sisters for their gifts. He obviously appreciates Martha's generous hospitality. He takes advantage of it over and over in the Gospels. And he values that Mary has a disciple's heart. Now they just have to learn to see each other and to appreciate each other and to sort of be in charge of their own development and response to Jesus. The next story we look at is in John 11. I'm beginning on verse 17. When Jesus arrived, he found that their brother Lazarus had already died and been in the tomb for 4 days. So he's coming to see them after the death of their brother. Now, Bethany was near Jerusalem, some 2 miles away, and many of the Jews had come to Mary and Martha to console them about their brother. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went and met him, while Mary stayed at home. Martha said to Jesus, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. But even now I know that God will give you whatever you ask of him." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And Martha responds, "I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day." Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. Those who believe in me, even though they die, will live. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this?" Martha answered him, "Yes, Lord, I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, the one coming into the world." This story shows us development in both Martha and Mary from our last one. In this passage, we see that Martha has a knowing, a clarity of heart and of knowledge about who Jesus is. In the Gospel of John, Mary does what Peter does in the other Gospels and declares that Jesus is the Messiah. Martha has come to understand his teaching and support his ministry and mission. She declares that he is the Son of God. In this passage, we see that she has come to appreciate and embody some of Mary's best traits without ever losing the sense that she's true to herself. It's a both-and moment. She's growing beyond who she was in the other passage. She's knowing and showing grace. We see this especially in this next interaction. After Martha had said this, she went back and called to her sister Mary and told her privately, "The teacher is here and he's calling for you." And when Mary heard that, she got up quickly and went to Jesus. Now, Jesus had not yet come to the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. The Jews who were with her in the house consoling her saw Mary get up and go out, and they followed her because they thought she was going to the tomb to weep there. When Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said, "Lord, come and see." And Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" One thing we can notice in this passage is that Martha is the one who greets Jesus. Mary has remained at home to console, with those who have come to console her. This allows Martha to be the one who greets Jesus first and have some time with him. This shows growth on Mary's part. She doesn't leap to take the front spot, but is willing to have later time with Jesus in order to give Martha time also and realize that she needs acknowledgement and time with him as well. Then after Martha's had time with Jesus, she goes and tells Mary privately, the teacher would like to see you. She knows Mary needs time. Now we know from the story that the crowd does stand up and follow her, but the intent is there. Martha has tried to give Mary private time with Jesus. In this passage, we see that each of them is tuned in better to the needs of the other and does what she can to support and care for the other. So intending to the own things they need and seeing each other more clearly, they become better friends and better carers for each other. They become something new individually and together. We pick up the story at verse 38. Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." And Martha said to him, "Lord, there's already a stench because he has been dead for 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I have said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you have sent me." When Jesus had said this, he cried out in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, his face wrapped in a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." One of the unusual things about Lazarus, other than being raised from the dead by Jesus, is that for someone so close to Jesus, he never gets a speaking part in these stories. I find that fascinating. That has led interpreters to believe that he was probably a younger brother. Now, that didn't keep Lazarus from being the absolute best role play when my 3 siblings would act this out. Being Jesus was great. We knew this from the King James Version. If you were Jesus, you put out your hands and would say, "Lazarus, come forth." And that was awesome. But then to be Lazarus, all wrapped up in rags from my mother's rag bag, stumbling out of the box, that was the best. I have to tell you, though, I did also like Martha's line, "Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days." It was an awesome role play. I digress. Back to Lazarus. We don't know much about Lazarus. We don't know what Lazarus thinks about all this. We don't get to hear Lazarus's words. Jesus said that his death and resurrection happened so that all those gathered would see the glory of God and know that God had sent Jesus. Lazarus was close to Jesus. He died and was raised by him. And we also know later in the Gospel of John that he ended up on the chief priest's hit list because his story of being resurrected by Jesus is drawing all kinds of people to Jesus. So for a guy who never speaks, he was a powerful witness to Christ's work in his life. Our last sibling passage happens after this resurrection. 6 days before the Passover, I'm beginning at verse 1 of chapter 12. Jesus came to Bethany, the home of Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. There they gave a dinner for him. Martha served, and Lazarus was one of those at the table with him. Mary took a pound of costly perfume made of pure nard, anointed Jesus' feet, and wiped them with her hair. The house was filled with the fragrance of this perfume. But Judas Iscariot, one of his disciples, the one who was about to betray him, said, "Why was this perfume not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" He said this not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief. He kept the common purse and used to steal what was put into it. Jesus said, "Leave her alone. She bought it so that she might keep it for the day of my burial. You always have the poor with you, but you will not always have me. One thing that pops out to me is that in this passage, there's a lot of drama that has nothing to do with a guest of honor. You know, we just have the one line about it was, the party was for Lazarus and he was there at the table with Jesus. Judas gets upset, but because it's Lent, we know the whole story, and because it said in the text that he was about to betray Jesus, we know Judas was already upset. This isn't really about the perfume. It's perfume adjacent. It's about the access to funds. And one thing I love about Jesus is that he calls Judas off. He tells him to leave Mary alone. What's important to notice from our perspective today in this whole scene is that the three siblings in this scene are all doing what they do with open hearts toward each other and their focus on Jesus. I get the image of iron filings lining up in a magnetic field. Lazarus is there. He's at the table with Jesus, being with Jesus, but not making a big deal about how close they are, although we can see how close they are from the text. He is the one that Jesus weeps over. Mary is honoring Jesus with what is probably her most expensive possession. A pound of nard would have been worth a year's wages at this time, and that much nard would often have been kept as a dowry for a young woman's marriage. And despite Judas and his protest, Mary remains focused on Jesus, and he receives her gift of this anointing with gratitude. We do find Martha serving again, but without the friction of comparison or frustration. I imagine, because it seems like she would have an organizational mind, that by now she's figured out that whatever she serves, it needs to be something that Mary can help her prep with ahead of time. Because she's also figured out that when Jesus is there, Mary needs to be with him. Mary hosts this gathering because it's what she does, and she does it well, and she does it with an open heart towards her guests and her siblings and her eyes toward Jesus. So much to notice here from these three siblings and their interaction with Jesus, their friend, the Messiah. They learn to be the bosses only of themselves as they learn how to become who God created them to be, in relationship with each other, in community, with Jesus. This is also our challenge. We have to learn how to maintain our focus on God, to trust God's love and acceptance of us, to fully become who we are, to keep our hearts open to one another during the season of Lent and in the days to come. Amen.